Should you get the iPad Air or the iPad Pro? In this video, I'm going to break down the specs of both devices, who these devices are for, and I'm going to try to make a case why you're not really saving that much money if you go for the Air versus the Pro. So let's start out with some of the things that are the same, because when you look at these devices on the surface, they seem pretty similar, and that's exactly why this video is so necessary, because a lot of people are going to look at these devices and think that they're getting almost exactly the same thing when that's not necessarily always the case. In terms of the enclosure, they both come with aluminum and glass on the front. Apple brought this design to the iPad back in 2018 with the new iPad Pros and have kept it all along. And basically you can see them moving all their other devices to this design language. So in terms of the enclosure, if you decide to go with the iPad Air or the iPad Pro, in terms of design, longevity, long term, it's not going to look outdated because they're both current, and that's the way that Apple is moving in terms of their design language. The iPad Air starts out at $600 and the iPad Pro starts out at $800. So there's a $200 difference between the entry-level models. And later in the video, I'm going to show you guys why that $200 difference is really more narrow than you actually expect. So in terms of subjectivity, you can talk about the colors and the biometrics. Obviously, the iPad Pros only come in two colors, silver and space gray, where the iPad Air comes in 5 different colors that you can choose from. Biometric wise, you have Touch ID on the iPad Air and you have Face ID on the iPad Pro. Both the color and biometrics, that is personal preference. I would rather prefer Touch ID, and I would prefer to have just a basic silver iPad. Now, both of these iPads support Apple Pencil 2 support. They both support the Magic Keyboard. And because they both have the M1 chip, they both also have 10 hours of battery life. The M1 chip is not only going to give you that speed, but more impressively, it's going to give you that longevity and power efficiency that allows you to get through a whole day of work on a single charge. And both of these iPads also support center stage. So if you're on a conference call or if you're on FaceTime, the camera is actually going to track your face and keep you in focus. Now let's start talking about some of the differences between these two iPads, which makes the iPad Pro a little bit more compelling than the iPad Air. Now on the iPad Air and the iPad Pro, you have a USB-C port, but on the iPad Pro, you have Thunderbolt 4 support, which means that you're going to be getting faster speeds and more connectivity from the iPad Pro. Another difference we see with the hardware are the speakers and the actual display. On the iPad Air, you get dual speaker, and on the iPad Pro, you get quad speaker. Now the iPad is a consumption device first and foremost. It's there to watch movies, watch videos, scroll Netflix, Facebook. It may not seem like a big deal watching a video with dual speakers, but it's the same difference that we saw with the iPhone when it had the one mono speaker on the bottom versus dual speakers from the microphone and the bottom. It makes a really big difference when you're consuming content, having those extra 2 speakers on the iPad Pro. So I'm going to give that to the iPad Pro right now. And in terms of the display, although the LCD panel on the iPad Air is really good, it's one of the best LCD panels, the 120 Hz ProMotion OLED display on the iPad Pro is second to none. It's one of the best panels you're ever going to see. And one of the big points I want to make in this video is that Apple products, they're pretty unique in the tech industry in that they last the longest, right? They're built with premium materials, they get software updates, and in terms of the design, Apple keeps their designs for a long time so they don't look outdated 1, 2, 3 years down the road. So when you're making the decision to buy the iPad Air versus the iPad Pro, you need to also consider where the technology is going and how your workflow is going to change, because the stuff that you do now is not going to be the same as the stuff you do 2, 3, 4 years from now. So when you go into an investment like the iPad and you want to spend the extra $200 on the iPad Pro, it's worth it because not only is the content that you're consuming going to be more enjoyable on an OLED 120 Hz ProMotion display, the actual fluidity of the OS and the longevity of that device is going to be longer if you spend the extra money and invest it in higher quality specs like the display. The iPad is pretty much just a display, so you want to invest most of your money in an iPad that has the best quality interface if you're going to be interacting with it every single day. That's not to say that the iPad Air is a bad device, but when it comes to investing in an iPad for the long term, you want to put your money with the Pro model. And when you look at the difference in terms of RAM, the iPad Air has 8 gigabytes, and the iPad Pro, you can configure up to 16 gigabytes of RAM, which allows you to extend the lifespan of that device if you decide to go with more graphically intensive work or use multiple apps in the background down the line. So I went through all the similarities, all the differences. Now let's go back to the price, because in the beginning of this video, I said that the iPad Air starts out at $600 and the iPad Pro at $800. On the surface, it looks like there's a $200 difference. But what we didn't talk about is that 64 gigabyte entry-level $600 iPad Air is not enough, especially with modern day apps and everything you want to store natively on that device. So inevitably, you're gonna have to spend at least $750 to get to that next 256 gigabyte iPad Air. And if you're spending $750 on a 256 gigabyte iPad Air, you're only $50 away from the entry-level 128 gig iPad Pro. So for $50 extra, you're getting 128 gigs, which is less than 256, but still more than 64. You're getting 120 hertz OLED ProMotion display. You're getting quad speakers. You're getting 16 gigabytes of RAM. You're getting Thunderbolt. You're getting an extra camera on the back with LiDAR and support for 3D and augmented reality apps. So on the surface, when you look at the difference, it's a $200 difference, and people get sticker shock and say, wow, I'd rather go with the Air. But when you actually break it down with the usable features and think about the iPad as a 5-year investment device, the iPad you buy now, you're probably going to have for the next 3, 4, 5 years. So when you take that into consideration, buying the iPad Pro makes sense 9 times out of 10, especially knowing that you can go on Apple's website on the refurbished section and get a discounted iPad Pro for almost the same price as a brand new iPad Air. With that said, guys, let me know in the comments what you think about this comparison. Personally, I would go with the iPad Pro if I was an iPad guy. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on my future content, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.